Hey everybody, this is an essay from Marx and Marxism by Iring Fetscher. It's titled "The Relationship of Marxism to Hegel." This piece is very long, so I'm not going to read it as a full piece. I'm going to read it section by section, and that's how I'm going to put the recordings up. I might condense some of them if like one section is really short, because that just, there's a point to which you make such short videos that it's just like tedious to upload them online and not really like worthwhile. Like it's not a very good use of time. I don't know how long any individual section is. I might combine sections, but this is part of the piece, The Relationship of Marxism to Hegel. Okay, so let's go. This is the introduction. That's the section that this video is going to be. The relationship between Marx and Hegel is not an academic problem for the ideologists of the Marxist parties. Just as conceptions of the essential nature of Marx's doctrines themselves change, so the relationship between the latter and Marx's major, quote, precursor, end quote, in philosophy must be subject to different interpretations, which therefore acquire political significance, at least indirectly. Quote, tell me how you define the relationship between Marx and Hegel, and I will tell you what kind of Marxism you have chosen, end quote. One might easily modify Fichte's famous dictum thus: this is true not only of Stalinism and Stalinism's notorious hostility to Hegel, but of the theoreticians of the Second International and of Lenin, their staunchest critic. From one specific standpoint, the history of the differing interpretations of the relationship between Marx and Hegel reflects the history of the development of Marxism itself. On the other hand, the problem also has an aspect which is of relevance only in the history of philosophy. Many of Marx's early writings were not published until long after his death, and it was these particular texts which showed just how close a relationship there was between the arguments and questions debated by Marx and Hegel. Footnote: the German ideology appeared for the first time in a complete version in 1932 in the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe, Volume 5, let's make it 1, while the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844 were published in the same year in Volume 3. Other early writings, such as The Holy Family and the two important essays from the Deutsch Franz Sicher Jahrbucher, namely On the Jewish Question and the Introduction to a Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, were already known from the first editions and the publication of the posthumous writings of Franz Iring. The first part of the German ideology has been published by the Marx-Engels Archive had been published by the Marx-Engels Archive in 1925. However, end footnote. However, an almost equally important contribution to this changed historical evaluation has been made by the increased attention paid to Hegel's early works, which, starting from Knoll's edition of the early theological writings and continuing all the way to Hofmeister's extremely valuable editions of the works from the Jena period, have thrown light on a hitherto neglected, if not unknown, aspect of Hegel. I'm going to see if there's any information on Knoll. Knoll Hegel. Yeah, it's just like there's translations of Knoll's editions of Hegel's early theological writings, and Hofmeister. It looks like he's it looks like there's a so it looks like Johannes Hofmeister, who lived from 1907 to 1955, was a Hegel scholar who I guess compiled the Lectures on the Philosophy of World History by Hegel. That's all I'm really seeing. Let's see. Johannes Hofmeister. Johannes Hofmeister is a philosopher and a Germanist. Looks like he was a Nazi. that's important. Yeah, sorry. The thing, things for his, I don't know. The biography on the German Wikipedia seemed too long to read. Anyway, back to the text. The very close attachment of this thinker to reality and his practical intentions were thus revealed for the first time, whereas the early theological writings are dominated by the problem of the, quote, becoming positive, end quote, positivität, end quote, positivity, end quote. For the young Hegel, it meant the transformation of a living, quote, existential, end quote, activity, conviction, or institution into a reified and sterile, quote, fact, end quote. One could call it, quote, petrification, end quote, as the result of a historical degeneration of the Christian religion and the delineation of the contrast between Christianity and a living, quote, people's religion, end quote, of the type characteristic of the Greek polis. The writings from Hegel's Jena period, if you don't know, when I'm saying Jena, it's spelled Jena, but the Y is like a Y sound in German. So Hegel's Jena period clearly shows Hegel's intense concern with modern national economy, James Stewart and Adam Smith, as well as with questions of society and law. There's actually a piece, I mention him a lot, but Chris Arthur has a very interesting piece. A very interesting piece from on I think it's, I can't remember what it's from. It's from, like, what's it? It's one of those books, like Value, Form, State, and something else. Some, like, title, you know, how all philosophy books kind of have generic-ass titles. Because they're dealing with very abstract concepts. But he has a piece that's like Hegel's Critique of Political Economy or something like that, or Hegel's Political Economy or something like that, which talks about some of, like, Hegel's ideas about political economy, and that Hegel was kind of like not aloof to these debates to the world of political economy. Anyway, knowledge of these early works and projects could lead to a totally different and more realistic interpretation of Hegel's later writings as well. However, there is scarcely a single orthodox Marxist who made use of this possibility apart from Georg Lukács, who can be considered, quote, orthodox, end quote, only to a very limited extent. Just when the young Hegel had been completely, quote, discovered, end quote, Soviet philosophy became the province of Stalinist monotony, and Stalin was able to formulate his grotesque, quote, classification, end quote, of Hegel, which defined the Hegel as the embodiment of the, quote, aristocratic reaction against the French bourgeois revolution of 1789 to 1794 and against French materialism, end quote. I'm not sure, but I think was it Terry Pinkert or someone that said something that, like, Hegel routinely celebrated Bastille Day or something like that. So this kind of characterization of I don't know, Hegel as like an opponent of the French Revolution as such seems inaccurate to me. But it's Stalin, so everything he says is inaccurate. Even if the Stalinist formula will find scarcely any advocates in the communist camp today, there remains a latent, quote, mistrust, end quote, of Hegel, or more precisely, a mistrust of those intellectuals that base their beliefs on these works of the young Marx, which reveal the strong influence of Hegel. In my opinion, this trust stems from the fact that a genuine dialectical interpretation of Marxism, which sees and understands the latter's Hegelian origins correctly, for example, Georg Lukács, 1923, Karl Korsch, and Herbert Marcuse, can admittedly conceive the underlying trend in historical development and understand both the proletarian class consciousness and the proletarian revolution which results from proletarian class consciousness through a dialectical reversal, but cannot provide the basis for an instrumental mechanistic interpretation of the theory and the relationship between the theory and practice. Marxism is accordingly considered as an historical and only as such, quote, all-embracing, end quote, theory, which is necessarily converted into action and results from the will to action, but certainly not as universal scientific key to all philosophical and political problems, which, like modern natural science, could provide the basis for infallible practical results and become a reliable, quote, tool, end quote, in the hands of a competent minority of, quote, specialists, end quote. The, quote, orthodox Marxist, end quote, doctrine, which deviates from this genuine dialectical interpretation, owes its distinctive characteristics not only to the period during which this orthodox Marxist doctrine developed, 1880 to 1900, but to a whole range of non-theoretical factors which to some extent are equally applicable to the Second International, on which Lenin later cast such scorn, and to Russian Marxism. 1. The theory ceased to an increasing extent to serve for the preparation of collective revolutionary action, began to serve instead the integration of the Weltanschauung of the proletarians and other adherents of the labor movement. Footnote. Erich Matthias, quote, Kautsky und der Kautskianismus, end quote, in Marxismus Studien 2, Tübingen, 1957, as well as my own contribution, quote, From the Philosophy of the Proletariat to the Proletarian Philosophy, end quote, in this volume, end footnote. Common action was replaced by a common faith, and to the extent that action lost credibility, the faith took on heightened strength and extended to other areas remote from politics, Weltanschauung. 2. The party leadership was faced with the practical problem of, quote, leading, end quote, the proletariat masses and the rest of the population after October 1917. This resulted already for Lenin in an undialectical interpretation of the relationship between the party and proletariat, theoretical leadership and practical followers, according to which all activity emanates from the party and is conveyed to the masses by special, quote, transmission belts, end quote, levers, end quote. And this concept remains more powerful than the well-known formula of the significance of the, quote, creative initiative of the masses, end quote. According to a genuine dialectical theory, the party would be just as much a, quote, product, end quote, of class as class is a product of the party. Activity would not be a one-way movement from, quote, from the, quote, top, end quote, downwards, but instead there would be a genuine, quote, unity, end quote, between the two levels. Class, and not the party, quote, leadership, end quote, would have the overriding power. According to the, quote, materialist, end quote, theory, Lenin therefore deviates in two respects from Marx. On the one hand, because Lenin views the relationship between the party and class in undialectical terms, quote, mechanical, end quote, images made this clear, as Paul Levy had recognized, and on the other hand, because Lenin interprets the relationship idealistically and elevates the party theory as the overriding and all-embracing factor. In this respect, Georg Lukács followed Lenin strictly in 1923. 3. The abstract and general concept of dialectical materialism led to the establishment of an undialectical epistemology, the theory of reflection, which inevitably conflicted with the doctrine of the developing identification between subject and object, which was to be achieved in the, quote, revolutionary practice, end quote, of the proletarian revolution. 4. The direct struggle The direct struggle against religion led already in the case of Lenin to one-sided emphasis on, quote, materialism, end quote, according to which the vulgar materialism of the 17th and 18th centuries was eventually elevated above classical German idealistic philosophy, although this cannot be reconciled either with the words or the spirit of Marx's doctrine. See Lenin's mentor Plekhanov, I've been told that's how you say it, who detected a direct line of development from Helvetius and Holbach to Marx. Whereas Marx wanted to defeat religion by eliminating the social motives which supposedly led to religion's development, Lenin demands, at least as a second form of action, a direct critique of religion in the name of materialism and natural science. 5. The Soviet Union approached in practice a form of Hegelianism interpreted in extremely reactionary terms by developing the theory into an all-embracing total system, which differed from that of Hegel only by the new designation, quote, materialism, end quote, adopted for it, and no longer by the opposed function. At the same time, however, the Soviet state adopted a position as absolute as that which Hegel envisaged for the, quote, rational, end quote, modern constitutional state of his own day. As in a purely Hegelian structure, the freedom of the citizens of the Soviet Union resides purely and simply in the fact that they have the right to convince themselves of the absolute reasonableness of the existing order with the help of the doctrines of Marx and Lenin. Presumably, there lies in this semi-conscious approximation to the distorted model of a reactionary Hegelian state a strong motive for breaking in the official theory. An ideology has the function, according to Marx, of acting as a corrective to the deficiencies of reality. Every bridge between Marx and Hegel, and combating every Hegelian influence on Marxism as a deviation. Footnote. See Henri Lefebvre, Le Marxisme et le Pensée français in Thème moderne, especially the passage quoted in a later note. Where am I? The materialist doctrine would then have a kind of, quote, magical, end quote, function. By constant repetition of the formulas of dialectical materialism, the practical idealism on which the party rule in fact is based should be prevented from becoming seen. The material, quote, entrails of society, end quote, the, quote, working masses, end quote, must be held from criticism and revolt by the fact that their leaders constantly assure them that the general line of action is not determined by the party, but by themselves, not by idealistic theory alone, but by materialist theory in harmony with materialist practice. However, the real opponent of Leninist orthodoxy is not Hegel, but the young Marx, who was responsible for the most radical criticism of the Hegelian system, in parallel with Kierkegaard, although admittedly from a different angle. A system which has become wholly, quote, Hegelian, end quote, is not threatened by the later conservative theory of Hegel, but by the revolutionary humanist Marx. The criticism which Marx directed against the necessarily imaginary liberation of man in the Hegelian state can be applied with even greater justification to the present-day Soviet Union. The Soviet citizen is also free, quote, in spirit, end quote, only when he elevates himself with his Marxist-Leninist training to, quote, the level of consciousness of his leaders, end quote, and identifies himself with their will. The actual man with his actual requirements and desires has as little freedom in the Soviet world as in any reactionary state, quote, class liberation, end quote, as Polish scholars justly remarked at the Freedom Congress held in East Berlin in 1956, has nothing to do with the concrete freedom of the members of that class, and does not necessarily follow from such freedom. It is therefore not an accident that, for example, Otto Grotewohl, in a speech on the subject of freedom in his state, the German Democratic Republic, used formulas which are remarkably reminiscent of Hegel. Let's see what German Wikipedia has to say. I love German Wikipedia. It's so informative on these more minor figures that are not well known in the West. Wikipedia says, German Wikipedia says, Otto Grotewohl who lived from 1894 to 1964, was a German politician, SPD, from 1946, SED. Otto Grotewohl was a member of the Politburo of the SED from 1949 to 1964. And from 1949 to 1964, Prime Minister of the German Democratic Republic. So I don't. It's always weird when there's like prime ministers versus like, I don't know, heads, because like, what is this guy's relationship to Walter Ulbricht? You know what I'm saying? Where am I? Ooh, is there anything? Where am I? Yeah, I'm trying to see if there's anything about his thought, but it doesn't seem like it's just all kind of like biographical information, factoids. So we finally arrive at a paradoxical situation in which the Soviet ideologists are loudest in their condemnation of Hegel at the very time when the Soviet ideologists' state and system of thought have approached closest to the thought of the late Hegel. So that's the end of the introduction. Thanks for listening.